Rain poured over the ranch. When the veteran opened the door, 8 native girls stood there, soaked. The storm came without warning, turning the Montana sky black as midnight in the middle of the afternoon. Harold Brennan set down his coffee cup and watched through the kitchen window as sheets of rain hammered the pasture where his cattle huddled together for shelter. Lightning split the darkness, followed by thunder that shook the old ranch house to its foundation. He had seen plenty of storms in his 68 years, but this one felt different. The rain fell with an urgency that suggested the sky was emptying itself of every drop it had ever held, and the wind howled like something alive and angry. Harold pulled his wool sweater tighter around his shoulders and checked the locks on the windows, a habit left over from his years as a soldier in Vietnam. When the knock came at his door, he almost didn't hear it over the roar of the storm. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and insistent, cut through the chaos of wind and rain. Harold froze, his weathered hand halfway to the lamp switch. In 37 years of living alone on this isolated ranch in the Bitterroot Valley, no one had ever come to his door during a storm. Hell, no one came to his door at all unless they were lost or looking for trouble. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. Harold grabbed the shotgun from behind the kitchen door, checking the load out of habit before moving toward the front of the house. His boots echoed on the hardwood floors as lightning illuminated the windows in stark white flashes. Through the frosted glass of the door, he could see shapes moving, dark figures outlined against the storm. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded troops in the jungle. No answer came, just the relentless sound of rain and another series of knocks that seemed to grow more desperate with each strike. Harold unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open, keeping the chain latch engaged and the shotgun ready. What he saw made him forget every precaution his military training had drilled into him. 8 young women stood on his porch, soaked to the bone and shivering in the driving rain. They couldn't have been more than 16 to 25 years old, their long black hair plastered to their heads, their traditional buckskin clothing dark with water. They huddled together like a flock of lost birds, their dark eyes reflecting the lightning that continued to tear across the sky. Native girls, Blackfeet, by the look of their clothing and the way they carried themselves. But what were they doing 30 miles from the reservation, alone in the worst storm Harold had seen in a decade? The eldest of the group stepped forward, water streaming from her hair as she spoke in accented English. "Please, sir, we need shelter. Our truck broke down on the highway." Harold stared at her for a long moment, his mind struggling to process the situation. 8 young native women, stranded in a storm that could kill them if they stayed outside much longer. Every instinct told him to be cautious, to question their story, to protect himself and his property. But another voice, one that sounded suspiciously like his long-dead mother, reminded him that hospitality was a duty, not a choice. He lowered the shotgun and slipped the chain latch. "Get inside," he said, stepping back to let them enter. "All of you, quickly." They filed through the door, like ghosts materializing from the storm, their movements graceful despite their obvious distress. Harold closed the door behind them and turned to face his unexpected guests, suddenly aware of how the house must look to them. He had lived alone for so long that he had stopped seeing the bare walls, the sparse furniture, the complete absence of anything that might be called decoration or comfort. The women stood in his entryway, dripping onto the hardwood floor and looking around with expressions that mixed gratitude with uncertainty. They were beautiful, Harold realized, with the kind of natural elegance that reminded him of wildlife, deer or elk moving through the forest with unconscious grace. "I'll get some towels," he said, propping the shotgun against the wall. "And blankets. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." The eldest woman nodded, her teeth chattering as she tried to speak. "Thank you. We are sorry to trouble you." "No trouble," Harold said, though part of him wondered if that was true. "I'm Harold Brennan. This is my ranch." "I am Ayana," she replied, gesturing to herself before indicating the others. "These are my sisters and cousins. We were traveling to Missoula when the storm caught us." Harold nodded and hurried to the linen closet, grabbing every towel and blanket he could find. When he returned to the living room, he found the women had arranged themselves near the fireplace, their movements creating small puddles on his floor. They looked even younger up close, and he felt a protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. "Here," he said, distributing the towels and blankets. There's a bathroom down the hall if you need to change. I think I might have some old clothes that could fit some of you." As the women began to dry themselves, Harold busied himself building up the fire, adding logs until the flames roared high enough to provide real warmth. The familiar ritual of tending the fire gave him something to do with his hands while his mind tried to make sense of the situation. He hadn't been around people this young in years. Hadn't been around women at all since his wife Margaret had died of cancer 15 years ago. The presence of so many strangers in his house should have made him nervous, but instead, he found himself oddly comforted by the sound of their voices, the way they looked out for each other, the simple fact that his home was no longer empty. "Mr. Brennan," Ayanna said, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Do you have a telephone? We should call someone to let them know we are safe." Harold shook his head. "Phone lines are down. Happen every time we get a storm like this. Won't be back up until tomorrow at the earliest." The young woman's face fell, and Harold saw genuine worry in her dark eyes. "Our families will be concerned. We were supposed to arrive in Missoula hours ago. Nothing we can do about that right now," Harold said gently. "Storm's too bad to drive in anyway. You'll have to wait it out here." As if to emphasize his point, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, followed by the sound of something large hitting the roof. Probably a tree branch, Harold thought, making a mental note to check for damage in the morning. One of the younger girls, who couldn't have been more than 16, began to cry quietly. An older woman, perhaps Ayanna's sister, moved to comfort her, speaking softly in what Harold assumed was Blackfeet. The sound of their native language filled the room with music that seemed to calm everyone, including Harold himself. "What's wrong with her?" he asked. "Lily is afraid of storms," Ayanna explained. "She was struck by lightning as a child. The scars have healed, but the fear remains." Harold looked at the girl with new understanding. He had his own fears, his own scars that couldn't be seen. The war had left him with a startle reflex that made him jump at sudden noises, and crowds of people made him anxious in ways he couldn't explain. Everyone carried damage of one kind or another. "I'll make some coffee," he said, "and see what I have for food. You must be hungry." In the kitchen, Harold rummaged through his cupboards and refrigerator, trying to figure out how to feed 8 unexpected guests. He wasn't much of a cook. His meals usually consisted of simple things that could be prepared quickly and eaten without fuss. But he found ingredients for sandwiches, a pot of soup that could be stretched, and a package of cookies that Margaret had bought and he had never opened. As he worked, he could hear the women talking quietly in the living room, their voices mixing English with their native language in a way that created its own rhythm. Occasionally, one of them would laugh, a sound that seemed impossibly bright against the darkness of the storm outside. Harold realized that he couldn't remember the last time he had heard laughter in his house. When he returned to the living room with a tray of food and mugs of hot coffee, he found that the women had transformed the space simply by their presence. They had arranged themselves in a circle around the fire, some sitting on the floor, others curled up on his old couch. Their wet clothes hung over chairbacks to dry, and they were wrapped in his blankets like colorful cocoons. "This is very kind of you," said one of the women he hadn't spoken to yet. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility. "I am Dr. Sarah Crow Dog. I was giving a presentation at the university about traditional medicine." Harold nearly dropped the tray. "You're a doctor?" Sarah smiled at his obvious surprise. "I have a PhD in ethnobotany from Montana State. I study how my people's traditional plant medicines can be integrated with modern medical practice." "And I'm studying to be a teacher," added another young woman. "My name is Maria Running Bear. I want to help preserve our language and stories for the next generation." One by one, the women introduced themselves and shared what they were doing with their lives. There was Jessica Crow Feather, an artist whose paintings were being exhibited in galleries across the region. Anna Little Wolf was a lawyer working on water rights issues for the tribe. Rachel Two Bears was a veterinarian who specialized in treating horses and cattle on reservations throughout Montana. Each woman had her own story, her own ambitions and achievements. Harold found himself genuinely interested in their work, asking questions about their studies and careers in a way that surprised him. He had lived in isolation for so long that he had forgotten how engaging it could be to learn about other people's lives. "What about you, Mr. Brennan?" Ayanna asked, accepting a mug of coffee with grateful hands. What is your story? Harold settled into his recliner, the chair where he spent most of his evenings reading or watching the news. Not much to tell. I'm a rancher, raise cattle, tend the land, been here most of my adult life. But before that? Sarah pressed gently. You have the bearing of a military man. Harold's jaw tightened slightly, an automatic response to questions about his past. Army. Did 2 tours in Vietnam. Came back and bought this place with my wife. She died 15 years ago. The simple words carried more weight than their brevity suggested, and the women seemed to sense the depth of loss and loneliness they represented. They didn't push for more details, didn't offer empty platitudes about his service or his grief. Instead, they simply acknowledged his sharing with respectful nods and continued to treat him with the same easy familiarity they showed each other. As the evening progressed and the storm continued to rage outside, Harold found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't experienced in years. The women shared stories of their families and traditions, their hopes and dreams for the future. They spoke of ceremony and spirituality, of the importance of maintaining connections to the land and to each other. Our grandmother always said that storms bring people together for a reason, said one of the younger women, whose name was Jennifer Spotted Eagle. She believed that the spirits use the weather to arrange meetings that are meant to happen. Harold had never been particularly spiritual, but sitting in his living room surrounded by these remarkable young women, he found himself wondering if there might be something to the old woman's belief. Certainly, the timing of their arrival felt like more than mere coincidence. Tell me about your grandmother, he said, genuinely curious. Jennifer's face lit up with obvious love and respect. She was a medicine woman, a keeper of the old ways. She could read signs in the behavior of animals, in the patterns of clouds, in the way the wind moved through grass. She taught us that everything is connected, that there are no coincidences, only connections we don't yet understand. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney as the wind howled around the house. Lightning continued to flash at the windows, but the thunder was moving further away, suggesting that the worst of the storm might be passing. She sounds like a wise woman, Harold said. She was, Ayanna added. She died last winter, but her teachings live on in all of us. She would have liked you, Mr. Brennan. She always said that a person's true character was revealed by how they treated strangers in need. Harold felt something warm spread through his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite identify. It had been so long since anyone had spoken of him with approval or respect that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be valued by another human being. I just did what anyone would do, he said, uncomfortable with the praise. No, Sarah said firmly. Not anyone. We passed 3 other houses before we reached yours. No one else answered their doors. You could have turned us away, could have told us to wait in our broken truck or find shelter elsewhere. Instead, you opened your home to strangers without question. The conversation was interrupted by a tremendous crash outside, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Harold jumped to his feet, his military instincts taking over as he moved toward the window to assess the situation. What was that? Lily asked, her voice tight with fear. Harold peered through the glass, trying to see through the driving rain. Lightning illuminated the yard just long enough for him to spot the problem. A massive cottonwood tree had fallen across his driveway, its trunk blocking the road completely. Tree's down, he announced, turning back to the room. Right across the driveway. No one's going anywhere until I can get it cleared. The women exchanged glances, and Harold could see concern in their faces. They had been planning to continue to Missoula once the storm passed, but now they were truly stranded until he could remove the obstacle. How long will that take? Maria asked. Harold considered the size of the tree and the equipment he would need to cut it up and move the pieces. Day or 2, maybe more if the chainsaw gives me trouble. It's a big tree. We cannot impose on your hospitality for that long, Ayanna said, though Harold could hear uncertainty in her voice. You're not imposing, Harold replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to. I've got plenty of room, and it's been... He paused, searching for the right words. It's been nice having company. The admission hung in the air between them, revealing more about his loneliness than Harold had intended to share. But instead of pity or discomfort, he saw understanding in the women's faces, acceptance of his vulnerability without judgment. Then we will stay, Sarah said simply, and we will help with whatever needs to be done. "We are not helpless, Mr. Brennan. We know how to work." As the night deepened and the storm finally began to ease, Harold found himself making sleeping arrangements for his guests. He gave up his own bedroom to the older women and set up makeshift beds in the living room and spare bedroom for the others. The house that had felt too big and too empty for so many years suddenly seemed just the right size. Lying on the couch while his guests settled in around him, Harold listened to the gentle sounds of people preparing for sleep, the rustle of blankets, the soft murmur of good night wishes, the steady breathing of bodies at rest. For the first time in 15 years, he fell asleep to the comforting knowledge that he was not alone. He woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and bacon, sounds coming from his kitchen that he hadn't heard since Margaret's death. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the air was clean and fresh in the way it only was after a violent storm. Harold dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found Sarah and Jessica preparing breakfast with ingredients they had somehow discovered in his sparse cupboards. The other women were setting the table and arranging wildflowers they had picked from his yard in a mason jar centerpiece. "Good morning," Ayanna said, looking up from the newspaper she was reading. "We hope you do not mind that we made ourselves at home." Harold looked around his transformed kitchen, at the activity and warmth that filled the space, at the faces that greeted him with genuine smiles and welcome. "I don't mind at all," he said, and realized that he had never meant anything more in his life. The breakfast was better than anything he had eaten in years. Seasoned with herbs the women had foraged from around his property and prepared with care that turned simple ingredients into something approaching a feast. They talked and laughed as they ate, including Harold in their conversations, as if he had always been part of their circle. After breakfast, Harold went outside to assess the damage from the storm. The fallen cottonwood was even larger than he had thought, its massive trunk completely blocking the driveway and its branches extending well into his yard. It would indeed take several days to clear, even with help. The women joined him outside, surveying the tree with the practical eyes of people who understood physical work. Without being asked, they began gathering the smaller branches that had scattered across the yard, creating neat piles that would make Harold's job easier when he started with the chainsaw. "You don't need to do that," Harold protested, but his words were ignored as the women continued their work with efficient teamwork that spoke of experience with manual labor. "Many hands make light work," Anna said, dragging a large branch toward the pile. "Besides, we are part of the problem. If we had not been here, you would not need to clear the driveway so urgently." Harold wanted to argue, to tell them that their presence was not a problem but a gift, but he sensed that they needed to contribute, to feel useful, rather than simply dependent on his charity. So he got his chainsaw and began the work of sectioning the massive trunk while the women continued to clear debris and stack the pieces he cut. They worked together through the morning and into the afternoon, taking breaks to drink water and share stories about their lives and families. Harold learned about the reservation where most of them had grown up, about the challenges and triumphs of maintaining cultural identity in a modern world, about the strength of communities that looked out for each other through good times and bad. In return, he found himself sharing memories of his own past, stories about Margaret and their life together, about his experiences in the war and his struggles to readjust to civilian life. The women listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions that helped him process experiences he had carried alone for decades. By the second day, Harold had begun to think of his guests not as strangers who had been forced upon him by circumstance, but as friends whose company he genuinely enjoyed. They had established routines that included him naturally. Sarah and Jessica took turns cooking meals that were far better than anything Harold had prepared for himself in years. Maria and Anna helped with ranch chores, proving surprisingly knowledgeable about cattle and land management. The younger women, Lily and Jennifer, spent time organizing Harold's chaotic bookshelf and repairing small damages around the house that he had learned to ignore. On the third evening, as they sat around the fire after another excellent dinner, Ayanna approached Harold with something that looked like nervousness in her usually confident demeanor. "Mr. Brennan," she said, settling into the chair across from his recliner. "We have been talking and we would like to ask you something." Harold set down his coffee cup, giving her his full attention. "What is it?" "In 2 weeks, our tribe is holding a ceremony to honor our elders and the wisdom they have passed down to us. It is a celebration of community, of the connections that bind us together across generations and cultures. We would like you to attend as our honored guest." Harold felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. The idea of being welcomed into their community, of being considered worthy of such an honor, was almost overwhelming, but it was also terrifying. He had lived in isolation for so long that the thought of being surrounded by hundreds of strangers made his hands shake. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I'm not good with crowds. Haven't been around a lot of people in years." "You have been around us," Sarah pointed out gently. "And you have been nothing but gracious and kind. Our people would be honored to meet the man who opened his home to 8 stranded women without hesitation. Besides," added Jessica with a smile, "we will be there with you. You will not be alone." Harold looked around the circle of faces that had become so familiar and dear to him over the past few days. These remarkable women had brought light and laughter back into his life, had reminded him that isolation was a choice rather than an inevitable condition of grief and loss. "I'll think about it," he said, and saw hope light up in their eyes. The tree was finally cleared on the 4th day, the driveway restored to its full width, and the debris stacked neatly for future use as firewood. The women's truck had been repaired and returned by a mechanic from the reservation, and there was no longer any practical reason for them to remain at the ranch. Harold stood in his yard, watching as they loaded their belongings and prepared to continue their journey to Missoula. The house behind him felt empty already, despite the fact that they hadn't yet left. The silence that had once been his comfort now seemed oppressive, a weight that pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Thank you," Ayanna said, approaching him for a final goodbye. "For everything. You have been more than kind." "Thank you," Harold replied, his voice rougher than usual, "for reminding me that I'm still alive." She smiled and embraced him, a gesture that would have made him uncomfortable just a week ago, but now felt natural and right. One by one, the other women said their goodbyes, each leaving him with words of gratitude and invitations to stay in touch. As their vehicles disappeared down the road, Harold stood alone in his yard and tried to remember what his life had been like before the storm had brought them to his door. The ranch looked the same, the mountains were unchanged, the sky was the same endless blue it had always been, but everything felt different, charged with possibility and connection that had been absent for far too long. That evening, Harold sat in his recliner and looked around his living room. The blankets had been folded and returned to the linen closet, the dishes washed and put away, the makeshift beds dismantled, and the furniture returned to its original positions. But traces of his guests remained. The mason jar of wildflowers still graced the kitchen table. A book of poetry that Jessica had been reading lay forgotten on the side table, and the faint scent of the sage they had burned in ceremony still lingered in the air. 2 weeks later, Harold Brennan drove to the Blackfeet Reservation for the first time in his life, his hands gripping the steering wheel of his pickup truck with nervous tension. He had spent hours deciding what to wear, finally settling on his best jeans and a clean shirt that Margaret had bought him years ago, but he had never worn. The ceremony was held in a large meadow near the reservation's cultural center, with hundreds of people gathered in a great circle around a central fire. Harold felt overwhelmed by the crowd at first, his military training making him hyper-aware of exits and potential threats. But then he saw familiar faces in the crowd, 8 young women who waved and smiled and beckoned him forward with obvious joy. Ayanna introduced him to her family, to the elders who had organized the ceremony, to children who looked at him with curious but friendly eyes. He was welcomed not as a stranger or an outsider, but as a friend who had earned his place in their community through acts of simple kindness and respect. As the sun set and the ceremony began in earnest, Harold found himself seated in the circle of honor reserved for special guests and respected elders. The drumming and singing that filled the air reminded him of the voices he had heard in his living room, but amplified and strengthened by the participation of an entire community. When Ayanna rose to speak about the importance of bridge building between cultures, she told the story of a rancher who had opened his home to 8 stranded travelers without question or condition. She spoke of hospitality as a sacred duty, of the way kindness could transform both giver and receiver, of the connections that could be forged when people saw past difference to recognize shared humanity. Harold felt tears on his cheeks as he realized that this ceremony was not just about honoring the past, but about creating a future where isolation and loneliness were choices rather than inevitabilities. The storm that had seemed like a disaster had actually been a gift, washing away the barriers he had built around his heart and clearing a path toward community and connection. After the ceremony, as people gathered around the fire to share food and stories, Harold was approached by an elderly man whose weathered face spoke of decades of wisdom and experience. "I am Joseph Crowdog," the old man said, extending his hand. "Sarah's grandfather. She has told me much about you." Harold accepted the handshake, feeling the strength and warmth in the elder's grip. "She's a remarkable young woman." "They all are." Joseph nodded, his eyes studying Harold with the intensity of someone who could see past surface appearances to the truth beneath. "They are the future of our people, educated and strong but still rooted in the old ways. They will need allies in the world beyond the reservation, people who understand that wisdom and knowledge can be found in many places." Harold understood that he was being offered something precious, a role in the lives of these extraordinary women, a place in their community that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. It was an honor he had never expected and wasn't sure he deserved, but it was also an opportunity to be part of something larger than his own grief and isolation. "I would be honored to help in any way I can," he said. Joseph smiled, the expression transforming his lined face. "Then you are truly welcome among us, Harold Brennan. The storm brought you to us for a reason, and we will not forget the kindness you showed our daughters when they needed shelter." As Harold drove home that night, his heart full of new connections and possibilities, he thought about the randomness of storms and the way unexpected events could change the course of a life. 8 young women had appeared at his door, soaked and stranded, and in helping them, he had discovered that he was the one who had been lost. The ranch looked different when he pulled into his driveway. No longer a fortress against the world, but a home that could welcome guests and harbor community. The silence that greeted him was comfortable now, filled with the echo of laughter and conversation, with the promise of future visits and ongoing friendships. Harold Brennan had spent 15 years in isolation, convinced that solitude was safer than connection, that independence was stronger than interdependence. But a storm had taught him that sometimes the greatest shelter we can offer is an open door, and the greatest gift we can receive is the trust of strangers who become family. The rain had poured over his ranch, washing away more than dust and drought. It had washed away the barriers around his heart, clearing space for the kind of love that transcends difference and creates community from the simple act of caring for one another. And in that clearing, Harold had found not just 8 remarkable young women, but a new understanding of what it meant to be fully alive.